everyone. Good evening. Before we begin, I first want to acknowledge that at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, we are on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous peoples, including Dakota land ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The history department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. I would add this evening that we also acknowledge the communities that neighbor our campus in the Twin Cities, and that connects us to today's book about Hilda Sims from Minneapolis, an alum of the University of Minnesota. So I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the chair of the history department. And behind the scenes, we have our department administrator, Amanda Nelson, managing our Zoom for this evening. So the way things will work is we'll have about a half an hour or so of a conversation with our author and a conversation partner, followed by questions from the audience. So you can be thinking about your questions and putting them in the chat whenever you have them. And towards the end of the hour, I'll start reading those out. So with that, it's really a great pleasure to welcome Jojo Bell, a current PhD student in our department. It's the first time, I'm pretty sure, that we've had featured a current graduate student as opposed to an alumni. And it's a rare accomplishment to be a published book author at this stage of one's career. Jojo Bell is also a major public historian in the Twin Cities as the executive director of the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota, and recently curated an exhibit at the Weizmann Art Museum here on campus called Seeking for the Lost, which was based upon ads seeking family members separated by enslavement and printed in the locally Black-owned newspaper, The Appeal. She will be in conversation with William Jones, my colleague in the history department, who is a leading scholar of 20th century US history with a focus on labor and race. He has published on African-American industrial workers in the Jim Crow South, the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and he's currently researching, in a very timely way, public employees and their unions and that sector and the role of race there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jojo to start telling us about this really fascinating book, Red Stained: The Life of Hilda Sims.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you guys for having me. It's really exciting to do this as a grad student, like you mentioned. So yeah, my book is called Red Stain: The Life of Hilda Sims, and it's actually the first full biography of Hilda, who was a Broadway star in the 40s and 50s, and she also got into TV in the 1960s as well. So she's a hometown girl. She's from Minneapolis. You mentioned that she went to the U, that's true, and she has a lot of kind of ties to Minnesota. Some of her family's still here. So she grew up on the north side of Minneapolis, but Depression era Minneapolis, so pretty different from the Minneapolis we know now. But by the time she got to New York in the 40s, she actually starred in a Broadway play called Anna LaCosta in 1944. And it was very popular, and it's sometimes referred to as one of the first plays that has an all-Black cast, but doesn't focus specifically on race issues like some of the struggles that Black people go through, or that featured roles that might be stereotypical, like Mammies, Jezebels, and comedic roles. And so it was first staged at the American Negro Theater, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about a little later, which they had their own kind of theories and ideas about how they wanted to train the next generation of Black actors. And their focus was really on like a humanist kind of perspective, wanting to make sure that that was the focus of whatever plays they were doing and not, again, kind of moving away from the stereotypical roles that were given to Black people when they were auditioning for things in Broadway. So I think it's very interesting that she came out of that collective of actors as someone who, grew up and spent most of her life in Minnesota. And I'm sure we'll get to touch on this as well, but that collective spirit, I think she kind of formed here in Minnesota before she even went to New York. She worked at the Phyllis Wheatley House, which was a settlement home that was started in 1924 here in Minneapolis. And so she was privy to kind of a front row seat to some of this community action, I guess you could say, in Minneapolis as well. And so I think that kind of like formed her as well. She did act here at the University of Minnesota. She was also in a few plays around the cities as well. So I feel like, in a sense, Minneapolis shaped her in a way that allowed her to show up the way she did once she arrived in New York. And I'm sure we'll also talk a little bit more about at the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota, or AICM. And so I started that in 2016. And so it is a Black history nonprofit, and we focus on Black Minnesota history through events and exhibitions. So it was really through this that I learned Hilda's story, because I was, at that moment anyway, I was going to give a presentation at the Coven, which is an all, like a woman's working space here, collaborative. They now have a couple of places across Minnesota and across the United States now too. But yeah, I was looking for a presentation to give at the Coven. I know I wanted to focus on women, obviously thematically makes sense. So I was just looking for Black Minnesotans who I felt like were interesting or had like a novel story or a story that people hadn't focused on before. And I came across Hilda, and really where I first saw her was like a Wikipedia page about her. Um, and it was interesting because all these little things about her life, all these little kind of like strings about her life, just came together and made me want to ask more questions about her. One is that she was accused of being a communist sympathizer, or basically being accused of being a communist, and she actually did have her passport revoked at one point. That she's from Minnesota, but she was in plays and on TV, and that she was actually pretty popular in her day as well. She played opposite of people like Sidney Poitier, who's a major Black actor in that time and a legend now. So I thought it was interesting that it just, to me, I hadn't come across her, and it's something I like to do, is study Black Minnesota history. So I was wondering, why hadn't I heard of her? And so as I was trying to fill out more of the presentation, I was like, oh, I need more information. Like, why was she deemed a communist? How did she get from Minneapolis to New York? Who is she with in New York? Why she is such a huge star? Why don't we know about her? And so I looked and I Googled, and I didn't see anything like a biography, right? I think some of the longest things I saw were probably the Wikipedia page, also a few articles, yeah, from the Star Tribune, past and like current ones, that again just kind of gave me little insight into her life, but nothing that was like a full picture of her life. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll like try to write her book. And I laughed because it's like, this is before I was a graduate student. I always wanted to write, and I was kind of practicing that in certain ways. Like I was trying to write articles that weren't getting published. And I was trying to find ways to like start doing that. But I thought, because her life is a narrative, it might be easier in a sense to write. And I mean easier because her life was so exciting. Like I didn't feel like I was sitting down being like, oh man, today I got to finish this and figure it out. It's just like one thing, those little pieces kind of came together. So yeah, so I thought, oh, maybe I'll try it. And so I did start, and I was like, okay, I'm getting way more than I thought I could do, right? Because I'd never written a book before. So I was like, okay, there's actually enough here about her. And that was even before I went to her archives. So her archives are housed at the Schoenberg Center for Black Research in Harlem, New York. So I already had a little bit about her, and then at that point I realized, yeah, I have to look at her papers. And I think as historians we talk about like silences in the archives, and I think that is definitely true. But for Hilda's story, it was more about curiosity because her papers were there. Like when she died, her sister actually she died in Buffalo, New York, and her sister took the papers down to Harlem because she knew the importance of her sister's story. So I think it's more that someone had to come along and be curious enough about this Black woman from Minnesota, right, who was popular in her time. Um, so yeah, so I think yeah, so from there, I kind of expanded it as much as I could. And then I pitched it to Josh Leventhal, who at that time was the director of the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And he said yes. And I did write like a whole, book proposal and all that kind of stuff, but which I'm not sure if he was expecting from me or not. But yeah, so like, and he was like, yeah, okay. And I was like, I'm going to be writing this first full biography on Hilda Sims. So I finished that. And then as I was finishing it, I applied for grad school. Still didn't know if I would get in or not, but I was like, well, I'm publishing a book too. So, if I don't get in, oh well. So yeah, so that's how I started, and that's kind of how I learned about her story. And what I think is important to me too is to speak to family members, especially if someone, if their family members are still here or around. And she has a niece who lives in North Minneapolis. Her name is Nanette, and Nanette was very open about Hilda's story and about her family in general. And so she kind of personalized Hilda in a way that sometimes papers can't, um, even though they were her personal papers. And I think a few important themes that come out of her book um, are like these broader themes that Black actresses and actors went through in this period. She definitely faced her fair share of colorism, but in a really interesting and complex way. Like she, at one point, played a South Asian woman. Her niece told me that at one point she turned down a role that was kind of racially ambiguous because she really wanted to, tap into her identity as a Black woman. And also, she testified in front of Congress in 1962 about discriminating hiring practices in theater. And she talked about how even if they had a role that was for a mixed race woman, they would cast a white woman. So there's all this complexity about her color because she was a very light complected woman that I found really interesting about her story. But again, it kind of ties to people who like Freddie Washington, who had that kind of experience as well, who was a lighter skinned Black woman who was also acting around the time. And I think another theme that comes out of this too is obviously political repression as experienced by artist communities, right? But particularly Black stars who were also kind of giving voice to the burgeoning civil rights movement at the period as well. So basically, and kind of what I suspect happens to her, and I can get into this a little bit, why I suspect and don't know. Um, but she, like I said, she does have her passport revoked. She was being surveilled by the FBI at one point for having supposed communist sympathies. And I write in my book, I kind of write around that and try to tell the reader why I feel that. Um, but I actually did ask the National Archives for those FBI files because they had never been asked for it before, so they have to be redacted. I asked for them when there was already a backlog, of like a years long backlog, and then COVID hit. So the messages got interesting. First, it was, you can call back, and leave a message. Then it was like, don't call us. And then it was like, you can only email us every 6 months. So yeah, that's kind of where it's left off now. I did get an email saying it's getting closer. But yeah, so I think, this theme of political repression of people who are vocal and in the like an artist community is definitely something that affected her career as well. Um, yeah, I hope that was not more than 10 minutes. I wasn't paying attention to the time too much, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jojo, for doing this and for writing a great book. I just want to say that I feel really lucky to be working with you at the U and to be learning from you. I thought the if people were able to see the exhibit at the Weissman, The Seeking for the Loss, which was a really an amazing exhibit of these portraits by Christopher Harrison, and based upon these ads that you found in the newspapers, looking for people who had been to connect with families who had been separated by enslavement, and then the way in which Christopher sort of imagined what these people might have looked like based in on little clues in the ads was a really it's a very powerful exhibit. I hope it actually will be. It's no longer at the Weissman. Is that correct?
Yeah, so
Uh,
it closed in February.
right. But I hope it gets another um,
Yeah.
chance to exhibit those.
Mhm.
Um, and also your dissertation on Black homesteading families in Minnesota and Wisconsin in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a topic that when you first proposed it, I thought, well, were there any Black homesteading families? And it's really amazing to see that there were and there are records, and
Mhm.
so as that comes together. Um, so I one of the things that I think, Sarah mentioned that it's unusual for a graduate student to have a book published really, I mean, it came out while you were in graduate school, but you really wrote it before you came to graduate school. And it comes out of your work with the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota. And I wonder if you would just talk a little bit to start out about your work there and what does the AAICM do, and maybe how did you get into doing that
Mhm.
as a as work?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for saying that for sure. And I'm very honored to be one of your grad students too. So thank you for that. But yeah, so AICM started, I mean, kind of in the same way that the book started. So I came back, so I went to grad school in Louisiana at LSU. I got my master's at that point, and then I came back home and I was kind of searching for history jobs, at the Minnesota Historical Society. At that time, there was a Black History Museum that was going to open. But it never did open. So it's not the one that's in North Minneapolis now. It was by a different group of people. And I was excited about that because I really wanted to study Black Minnesotans. Because, personally growing up here, so I'm from Minneapolis, from Minnesota. So growing up here, like especially in school, it's just I wasn't seeing the representation of Black people, right? Historically, I think we kind of get this kind of like pioneer idea of Minnesota as very white. And although it's always been majority white, well, not always, obviously, but like once Europeans came here, right? It's been majority white. But I think the Black population in Minnesota, even though very small, was very influential. And I didn't necessarily understand that specifically when I started. I just wanted to hear stories about Black people in this space, right? I think to feel grounded myself. And I wasn't seeing that in terms of public history. There's scholarship on it for sure, but I think public history like a real like focus on it. So I just tried to do an exhibition kind of based off of what I'd seen myself as in like a museum goer, and with a little bit of experience in museum work. Like I did work at the American Swedish Institute for a little bit. So I picked up a few things there and tried to apply that to the first exhibition that we hosted, which was uh, it was about Black Minnesotans in the past, right? So I took some of these unidentified photos that you could find at the Minnesota Historical Society. So they were photos of Black people who weren't identified. And I added that with photos of people who were known, like George Bonga, who was a voyageur, fur trader, interpreter, and he was also half Ojibwe. Um, so, and again, I think so that's where it started, and how it started is just a personal desire to see those stories, and knowing that other Black people in Minnesota probably wanted to see those stories too. I didn't know like if if it would keep going beyond that or not. But there were a few really kind of already established Black people in Minnesota who got behind it, I think, which really ensured that it became um, a thing that more people knew about. So, yeah.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the book. And I think, I mean, one of the, it in some ways grows out of, because it grows out of your work for the AICM, it reflects that interest in Black Minneapolis and Black Minnesota. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more. You mentioned this in your opening, but about Hilda's life in Minneapolis and the people and the institutions that shaped her. You mentioned the Phyllis Wheatley House, the theaters that she worked at. Could you talk a little bit? I mean, tell us about what was the Phyllis Wheatley House and why was it important for development?
Yeah. Yeah, so it was at the time it was a settlement home. It's the Phyllis Wheatley Community Center now, and in fact, I think they just celebrated their 100th anniversary. But right, so they did social programs for kids in the neighborhood. They also offered job training and job placement to Black adults in the neighborhood as well. So it really was a community center where people could come to learn, get, like I said, get help with job training, job placement, and just a place for Black people in Minneapolis to kind of center themselves and be in community with each other. And it was also a place where Black stars or speakers would go to if they were traveling to Minnesota for something, for like a speech or an event. They would usually stay at the Phyllis Wheatley House because some of the hotels in Minnesota were actually segregated. So not like legally segregated, but would deny Black people the right to accommodations. So people like W.B. Du Bois even, but more specifically, Marian Anderson, who was a contralto singer, opera singer. In this period, she was actually denied accommodations at the Dyckman Hotel in 1939 in Minnesota. And Phyllis Wheatley Home, along with other activists, and I think it was the Women's Christian organization, also formed a protest against the Dyckman, demanding that Marian Anderson would get, accommodations there, would get a hotel room there while she was performing. And so she actually did. But the most interesting thing I think about that is that this was just a few months before she was denied Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And this, as you know, kind of is part of this, like the start, right? Like happening as the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was growing. And so she was denied Constitution Hall to sing at. And then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt actually resigned from the Daughters of American Revolution and offered the Lincoln Memorial for Marian Anderson to sing at. So it's interesting that this first kind of flashpoint, right? One of the first flashpoints happens technically with the DAR and, being refused Constitution Hall, but just a few months before, this happened to her in Minneapolis. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And to be in that space that, that on one hand, it's sort of it's a really vibrant space because people are excluded from other spaces. But it reminds me of Earl Lewis, who is another graduate of this program who claimed, observed that segregation created this congregation, right? That
Yeah.
people sort of turn segregated spaces, and seems like the Phyllis Wheatley House is sort of that,
Mhm.
really exemplifies that idea that becomes this really vibrant space. And I know that students at the U often stayed there when they were excluded from dorms at the U,
Mhm.
and it, became a place that people could learn about the world and, movements and art and
Mhm.
culture.
Yeah, no, and to that point, a lot of the younger people also talked about they got the chance to see those stars like in person because they were staying at the Phyllis Wheatley House, right? Like who gets to see their favorite singer or like an orator, right, in person and interact with them. So you're right, it's like these opportunities that other people wouldn't be afforded anyway. So
yeah, have breakfast with them.
mhm. Yep. Yeah.
Um, so I wonder if let's talk a little bit about New York City and so when she goes to New York, and I'm particularly fascinated by the American Negro Theater, and you talked a little bit about this, about their sort of specific humanistic approach, and sort of not, trying not to sort of trade in stereotypes. But I wonder if you could talk more about what their approach was, where it came from, and
Mhm.
how it influenced her work.
Yeah, so it was founded in 1940 by Abram Hill and Frederick O'Neill, who are also actors. And it kind of moved around in its first forms. And then at one period, so the period when Hilda was a part of it, it was in the basement of what is now the Schoenberg Center of Black research, but it's also a library. And so they started out there and just kind of like moving around. But again, the focus was one to provide a space where Black actors could develop their craft with dignity, right? So outside of the lens of kind of this um, almost like white world of Broadway, right? Where they would have kind of just the space to express themselves as Black actors and actresses. But it was also, a very rigorous training that they went through. There was a 1 year probationary period where they had to kind of like prove that they had the acting chops to be there. Um, but within this too, they also wanted to foster better relations between Black and white Americans as well, again, by showing Black people as whole, complete people. And again, staging plays that are maybe not written with Black people in mind, but then, actually producing them and playing and starring in them, as well as writing some of their own plays as well. And Anna LaCosta kind of falls into that. Members also had like voting rights as well, but they also had financial responsibilities like dues, and things like that. So there was a real focus on um, showing a whole complete person, a Black person being that way. Again, kind of moving away from some of the stereotypical roles that were usually offered Black people in this period. And
Yes,
people, Mhm.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, and so, earlier I said this dignified space, and I think that really did produce major stars who had that as their focus. Like Sidney Poitier was a member of the American Negro Theater, or the ANT, as people refer to it. Ruby and Ossie Davis were, yeah. And so was Harry Belafonte. So especially, I think if you take the dignity piece and then apply it to how you see people like Sidney and Harry and Ruby carry themselves not only in their movies but off screen as well. That is kind of like a core principle of the ant too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I mean, and they're all actors who have a really, a high sort of political engagement as well. And I think that you can see that sort of that legacy continuing in all of their careers.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that sort of leads into where I want to go now with the impact of the Cold War, and sort of the influence of anti-communism, not just on her own career, but on a lot of the people that the Black artists that are around her. And I wonder if you could talk about that, but again, sort of both her experience with anti-communism and then the broader impact that it had on these Black artists.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think she got the attention of HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, just like people like Sidney Poitier and Paul Robeson did as well. So, the FBI is casting this wide net, often labeling anyone who associated with known communists as communists themselves. And at the time, Hilda was in this collective of Black artists, right? Not even just actors and actresses, but Black artists in Harlem, who are being accused of this, including Canada Lee and Alice Childress, who were in Anna LaCosta with her, and who were, co-stars for that. So labeling them subversives, and as I mentioned before, compiling files on them, following them, surveilling them, and watching them to see who they were, kind of communicating with. So there's this dual challenge of, for them, particularly for Black artists and actresses and actors, of trying to walk this fine line of, if you do, right, mention some of the injustices that they faced, right, if they did any kind of support of civil rights movements or certain groups or people, they would also be labeled subversives as well. And so Hilda's advocacy uh, wasn't, I think I could say it's not as direct as Sydney's, but I will say there are a few interviews that she did that you could say were like pro, former Soviet Union at the time. And she was talking about how their anti-racism at the time, and also talking about how she wanted to go to dance school there too. And I think this is from like a 1944 interview that she did. So I think that kind of kicked off any surveillance of her, or at least any indication, right, that she might have communist sympathies at the time. And you mentioned, like contemporaries like Sidney Poitier, who, the FBI asked him to do a loyalty oath. They asked him to, kind of like disavow Paul Robeson, who was, a renowned actor, singer. He was an athlete at one point. He was an activist at one point. And because he was such an outspoken advocate for civil rights, for labor rights, anti-colonialism, he became a target of the FBI, and his career definitely suffered. And some would even say like his health suffered as well because of it. And because he aligned himself with these like leftist politics, he was blackmailed during the McCarthy period. And he also had his passport revoked as well. And then, of course, in 1951, he did his petition, Recharge Genocide, and sent that to the United Nations. And in that, he was saying that, the treatment that Black people have faced in this country since slavery is essentially a genocide, right? And so, interestingly enough, and I'm sure you already know this, but it was rejected. So that's kind of interesting to me as well. But yeah, so people she associated with, exactly, were being labeled communist if they were kind of, in Hilda's words, plugging for civil rights, right? So it's a way to silence people. It's kind of, we're seeing now. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but
Mhm.
before I mean, I think one of the things that you do in the book really skillfully is to sort of use, I remember when you were waiting for the FBI records, and it was like, oh, they're going to come, and who knows when they're going to come,
They never did.
and you reached that point where you had to decide, were you going to finish the book or
Yeah.
just keep waiting for them? And I think you made the right decision to finish the book. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I think you do really well is to use the sort of stories that we do know, this,
Mhm.
like Poitier and
Mhm.
Robeson, and sort of to give it some context. But you do actually tell us a lot about her own experience with anti-communism from interviews and from other sources. And I guess I'm wondering, so maybe someday you'll get those FBI records, hopefully.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of, I mean, what do you, well, one question is what will you do with it, and sort of what do you sort of hope to discover that you don't already know?
Yeah.
But then what might you have you thought about, like what will you do with it? Will you I assume you won't write another book about it, but
Probably not. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I think I'll start with the question. I think you said what might I find in there that I don't already know about her?
yeah,
I think I'd hope to just find something more like specific about her, right? Was there something specifically that she said? Was there one, interview that she gave that kind of flagged the FBI? Is it because she was, who in particular was she talking to that kind of kicked them off? I think they were surveilling her when she was in Europe, because I honestly think the files didn't start till 51, and I think she was touring in Europe at the time. And I think her and some of the cast were in the the Godot play. I'm forgetting it now, but it's in the book. But so I'm wondering if, if it's had to do with something in Europe that people were kind of worried about. She did do interviews in Jet too, talking about kind of this difference in acting roles and, availability and access between Europe and the US. But she did mention too that, I mean, Europe wasn't devoid of its own racism either. So I just wonder what specifically, you know, what was the one instance, and then how did they surveil her in her day-to-day life, I think would be very interesting to find out. And then what I would do, I don't really know. Sometimes I think if I have like a website about the book, I would probably, put them on the website there. Someone asked for Alice Childress's files like long time ago, and they're just floating around there on the internet somewhere. So I'm thinking, maybe I could do something like that. Somebody also suggested to maybe give them to archives like the Schoenberg if they wanted them. I don't know if they would want them, but yeah, so I think those are two avenues it could go, but yeah. But I definitely want them visible, right? So that people can look at them themselves and find them, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, I want to get to some questions from the audience, but just one last question. I think, and you alluded to this, but I mean, I
Yeah.
think, in a lot of respects, we're living in another McCarthy era.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you have thoughts about what, does the history and the life of Hilda Sims give us some lessons that we can draw, or or at least some parallels that we can draw
Mhm.
for our own
Yeah.
condition?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think there are some, I think it's hard, or I'm scared to sometimes to make those like kind of direct connections. But I do think kind of this overall theme of like what is American, right? And using this idea of being un-American to accuse people of something, right? Whether it's like people who are talking out about, the war in Gaza, who are protesting. So I think that this is also something that Hilda had to face herself, right? She's talking about civil rights. She's on commissions where they're, discussing discrimination in Broadway. She wasn't a very like quiet person in that sense. So I think using things like being un-American is something that is kind of a direct parallel, because, taking her passport and saying that she's communist is effectively in that period specifically saying that she is un-American. Um, and I think really tied to how civil rights efforts were kind of tied to this broader international communist conspiracy, right? Positioning racial equality movements as aligned with Soviet ideas, I think, too. This is kind of, some people are being accused of being terrorists, right? And then maybe and we've seen, right, grad students have their visas revoked for these kind of same, um, not the same ideals, obviously, it's different in the period, but these same kind of like ideologies and thoughts, right? Especially those who are becoming targets because they are protesting. So those are kind of some of the parallels I saw.
Thanks.
Mhm.
So there's a question from Patricia. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that that possibility, that possibly an aspect of collectivity that Hilda Sims embraced as an artist could have been learned from her Minnesota upbringing. Can you speak a little more to that?
Yeah, and I think I was specifically thinking about the Phyllis Wheatley House and Will, how you were saying it was it was a vibrant place, right? It wasn't just, it was in a sense, it's like people at the Phyllis Wheatley House were creating their own culture in a sense, like their own Black culture in Minnesota. And then because she had such a base of her own Blackness there, I think once she went to Harlem, I don't think it was such a hard thing for her to try to figure out where she would fit in, right? And how she would fit in. I think it just probably came more natural to her because she had that experience at the Phyllis Wheatley House.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you'd think it would be like a shocking experience to go from Minnesota to Harlem, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but there are some similarities in like being in sort of in Black institutions in a Black space. And so, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so another question from Patricia. Can people ask their questions, or is that or should I just read this?
Or I can read it. I think, yeah.
I don't mind reading it. I just, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Patricia writes, just selfishly curious about what kind of play Hilda was in where she played a South Asian woman. Was it common for there to be multiracial representations in their plays? On that, you mentioned wanting to be respected by white folks. Did many white people come to see the plays she and the aunt actors were in? It's a great question.
Yeah. So Hassan was a play that she was in Europe. So I'm sorry, there was a second part of what was the first part of Patricia's question?
About where she played the South Asian
Yeah.
woman?
Yeah, so that was in Europe and not in the US. And then in terms of I guess like wanting to, I don't think it was for Ant anyway. I don't think it was necessarily kind of like a respectability thing, like wanting to present themselves in a certain way to white people. I think it was more that they wanted to find a sense of themselves through their acting that wasn't being portrayed in Broadway on stage, in film particularly too. And I think people were very interested in that. I think at the same year, maybe later, Carmen Jones was also on Broadway as well. I think it had all black cast. So people were, and it again on Broadway. So yeah, white audiences were drawn to this as well. And that's a good point, right? Even though it's not these stereotypical roles, people were still coming to these things. And in fact, like, Broadway like kind of main player people came to Ant to see Anna LaCosta, and that's how it got moved to Broadway, actually. So yeah.
And there was a lot of sort of white interest in Harlem, and I think part of what the pushback from Ant was like, this is, come and learn about Black life, right? Don't, it's not the sort of stereotypical things that you might be expecting going way back in a sort of minstrel show, or things that are like only focused on race and sort of the struggles of Black people, but let's, learn about other aspects of Black life. Was that part of the
Yeah.
message for Ant?
Exactly. I think it was. Yeah. And
Mhm.
I'm sorry. I see Nanette is here. That's Hilda's niece, by the way. Hey, Nanette. So
Yeah, we'll have a chance at the end for people to unmute and turn their cameras on if they want.
So a question from Tracy. Jojo, I wonder if you can talk about any tips you have about how to write for a popular audience. Did you get lessons that you will take to your dissertation?
Oh, that's a good question. Hi, Tracy.
Yeah.
Tracy is also my co-advisor. Um, ooh, that's a hard one. Tips about how to write for popularized. I think for me, I think the main difference, I feel is kind of like voice, right? I mean, that's just obvious, I guess, right? But that, I guess for a popular book, it has to, I mean, I think this can translate to dissertations too. And I know people who are using a more narrative voice in their dissertations, but I think that is kind of like a must in a sense, especially if you are writing something like a biography. It just has to, it definitely has to draw people in. And I think in some way, it's like I tried to really focus on kind of the fun parts of her life, but I did want to give that historical context because I saw so many things about her story that I kind of knew about Black actors anyway, just because I like watched too much TV as a as a kid. So I kind of like knew those stories, not from any kind of like intellectual thing. So I think I kind of knew what people would find interesting in that sense in terms of like a trade or popular book. So what people would want to find interesting about her. And then in terms of my dissertation, it's more and it's hard too because it's different period, like completely, right? It's like the 1960s and then like the 1830s through 1950s. So like for me, it's completely different and kind of like challenging in that way. And I think kind of just like more, developing or thinking about other people's theories about what you're writing about, right? And trying to figure out what context it fits in now and, kind of like the historiography of, Black homesteading. So like there's not this like necessarily, there's not like a historiography piece really. And I think the major tip for me is there's this book. It's literally called How to Write a Book Proposal, I think. And I just followed that to a T. Like it just lays out really plainly, right? Like what they want to see. And then the parts of it, and then which parts you can use and you can't use. So if you're just starting and you don't know where to start and you want to pitch to like a popular press or trade press, I think starting with books like that are very helpful because then you know what they're looking for and you're not just writing. Right? And then having to kind of like maneuver around that. So, yeah.
I'll say one thing I found so fascinating in the book, JoJo, is that Hilda Sims, acting is her passion, and particularly dramatic acting, right? She didn't want to be in comedic roles or musicals necessarily. But she did so much, right? I mean, it's interesting in the book there are some photographs of her, and some of them are the, glamour shots that an actress would have in that period. But then you have that photo of her where she's at a typewriter and she's got books in the background because she was writing during the war, right? For radio pieces about, educational things. And she continued to do that kind of diverse work throughout her whole career. And sometimes I was wondering if, it was out of necessity that she sometimes was, closed off from certain roles that she would have preferred to be doing. But also, I mean, it seemed like it was really, enriching work too, very intellectual work and labor work as well, like union work. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, sort of how, whether this was you know, something she had to do when she really wanted to be acting, or whether you think she really did want to be kind of well-rounded, kind of this Renaissance woman almost in the variety of work that she did.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think she kind of wanted to do both. I think when there were lulls in her career, I think she wanted to figure out how to use the talents that she did have, right? To whether that's just trying to find a job or figure out where her skills applied. She did work at kind of like a drug rehab place for a while, and there she was teaching people how to act basically, and they were like coming up with plays and things like that. So I think it becomes out of necessity, but it's also, a more like an extension of her. And then, she was also always a pretty intellectual person. She did go to the U, she wanted to teach. She went to Hampton University in Virginia. So I think that's always was just a part of her as well. And then later in life, she got her master's. I think, yeah, she was I think she was over 40 at that point. But yeah, so she goes back to school. So yeah, I think some of it was necessity, some of it was just using her skills. She was also on the New York Commission for Human Rights, right? So there she was also looking at discrimination on stage and opportunities for Black actors, but also other people of color like Puerto Ricans as well. So yeah, I think it's just like natural ties when she had lulls in her career.
So Ashley Harville is asking a question. First, she says, wonderful discussion. Thank you, Jojo. During your research on Hilda Sims, did you come across other Black artists from Minneapolis or the US whose lives and contributions and stories you feel need to be elevated today? And can we expect more books from you?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I found anyone I thought could be elevated in terms of like acting, but I think what surprised me, but that there were a lot of Black understudies here in like the theater scene. So I think maybe that could be something that someone could look into if they're, interested in like kind of the theater scene in Minnesota. Why were there so many like Black understudies for certain roles? I think that's interesting for sure. And then other books, I hope, you know, like I think a lot of people do try to like make their dissertation work a book. And I think because I have a little experience, like, in the trade, but then, you know what I mean? I don't know. I would hope that my dissertation work could have enough to, have a book, but I think that would be my second book if I had one. Yeah, I don't know if I would write. I think Hilda's story was just kind of like I don't know, a happenstance thing, but yeah. So yeah, to be seen, I guess.
Well, I'm glad it happened.
Me too.
Yeah. Do you want to close this out with anything? Is there anything you want to leave us with that we should take away from the book or from your other work?
Oh, yeah, I think probably just what I'm trying to do even with AICM is to encourage people to like find these Black Minnesota stories because it's always interesting how they intersect with these national themes, right? It's just like, there's people aren't into Minnesota history in general, I think. But then we think about people of color and like Black people in Minnesota, and I think that's a really understudied area. So I think the book just proves, right, that there are these really important, impactful stories that we just have not found yet, or, we're not curious about yet, or if they were, we didn't have the means to do it. I mean, I wrote this book before I was a grad student, so I had no funding. So, like, my trip to New York, I had to try to scrape together to do myself. And luckily, I had a friend who lived in New York at the time, and my cousin lived in New York at the time too. So, but the fact that too that if you're an independent scholar, it's going to be harder for you to publish this. And sometimes independent scholars are the people who are finding these understood, like known stories, if you will. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for talking to us about the book, and thanks for writing the book. It's really
Yeah,
a
thank you
treasure.
guys for inviting me. It's very, like I said, it's exciting to be on this as a grad student, so I really appreciate it. But
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks so much, Jojo. We're looking forward to more work from you. I'm sure your dissertation will be a book, and we'll have you back on the book club when that one comes out. And thank you, Will, also for coming and engaging in the conversation. Amanda's putting in the chat as well. Obviously, generous gifts have allowed us to support graduate students like Jojo, who go on to write these really terrific books. And this is our last book club for this season, but we have a great lineup for next fall. In September, David Perry, our Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies, and his co-author Matthew Gabriel are going to talk about their newest book, Oathbreakers, The War of Brothers That Shattered an Empire and Made Medieval Europe. And in October, another graduate student. So this is really a wonderful trend you've started, Jojo. Elizabeth Quillen has a book coming out on medieval nuns at war, rebellious, resilient, and rowdy women. So that'll be another good one on women's history. And then in November, Professor Catherine Gerbner has a new book coming out, Archival Eruptions, Constructing Religion and Criminalizing Obeah, which is a Caribbean religious movement in 18th century Jamaica. So we hope to see many of you there. And with that, I'll close out tonight's book club. Thank you so much for joining us. We can, if people would like to unmute, Amanda will allow that to happen now if you want to say hello to Jojo or Will.